The Dreamcast failed commercially. It also predicted almost everything that defines modern gaming. Online console play, living open worlds, cel-shaded aesthetics, voice interaction. The Dreamcast library was running experiments that the rest of the industry wouldn't catch up to for years. These are the games that are proof of that. Grandia 2 is the Dreamcast RPG that gets underrepresented in conversations about the platform's legacy, partly because it arrived in 2000 when the Dreamcast commercial fate was already being decided, and partly because it wasn't doing the futuristic thing that most of the games on this list were doing. What it was doing was making the turn-based combat system feel alive in a way that most JRPGs of the era didn't bother attempting. The IP cancel mechanic, which let you interrupt an enemy's charged attack before it executed, turned the ATB timer into an active decision space rather than a passive waiting system. Fights felt like they were happening rather than being processed. The movement system within combat, where characters physically cross the battlefield to reach targets and positioning effects which attacks are available, added a spatial dimension to turn-based fighting that the genre mostly abandoned in favor of pure stat management. The battles rewarded paying attention to where everyone was standing, which is a more interesting problem than optimizing a damage formula. The story is earnest in ways that occasionally tip toward naive. The themes of faith and disillusionment are handled with more conviction than sophistication, and some of the supporting characters are thinner than the central arc deserves. Those are real gaps. But Grandia 2's combat system was a genuine innovation in how turn-based design could feel kinetic rather than static, and it arrived complete and polished on hardware that was already being written off. That it found an audience at all says something about how good the game actually was.
Oh, by the way...
Shenmue cost more to make than any game had previously cost to make, and it spent that budget on building a version of 1980s Yokosuka, where every NPC had a daily schedule, every shop had operating hours, and the world kept moving whether Ryo was interacting with it or not. The game released in 1999, and the living world design philosophy it established, that NPCs should exist as participants in a world rather than as quest dispensers, is the direct ancestor of what Red Dead 2, Witcher 3, and Cyberpunk would later be praised for implementing. The QuickTime event as a cinematic gameplay device was formalized here. Shenmue used QTEs to maintain player agency during action sequences that the camera work and choreography required to be scripted. Pressing the right button at the right moment preserved the feeling of participation in a scene that was designed to look cinematic rather than game-like. Every game since that has used a similar mechanic during cutscene-adjacent moments is using Shenmue's solution to Shenmue's specific problem. The pacing is deliberate in ways that modern players often find difficult before they find rewarding. Ryo's investigation moves slowly because the world is designed to be observed rather than consumed, and the game asks for patience that contemporary design rarely demands. That patience is the cost of the immersion. A world that feels alive requires you to move through it at the speed of a world rather than the speed of a game. Some players never make that adjustment. The ones who do tend to find it transformative.
Excuse me?
Jet Set Radio came out in 2000 and proved that cel shading was a viable aesthetic choice rather than a technical limitation. The rendering technique, which applies flat, cartoon-like shading to 3D models to produce an illustrated visual style, had existed before JSR, but Sega's game used it to build a visual identity so strong and so specific that it became the reference point for cel shading as a conscious aesthetic decision rather than a hardware workaround. Wind Waker, Borderlands, Guilty Gear, Hades, every game that has used cel shading as an expressive choice is working in a lineage that this defined. The street culture that the game was built around, graffiti, inline skating, hip-hop, youth rebellion against corporate authority, was not common territory for video games in 2000, and the way JSR handled it was enthusiastic without being exploitative. The music has a specific energy that makes it inseparable from the game's visual identity. The soundtrack and the art direction were making the same argument in different languages, And that coherence is why the game's aesthetic has remained influential long after its mechanics have been surpassed. The gameplay itself is more interesting as an artifact than as a current recommendation. The grinding and tagging mechanics are functional, but the camera work is the kind of problem that 2000-era 3D games hadn't fully solved. That friction is real and worth knowing going in. But this game's influence isn't primarily mechanical. It's aesthetic and cultural, and on those terms it remains one of the most distinctive games the Dreamcast produced. The typing of the dead replaced the light gun in House of the Dead 2 with a keyboard and a Dreamcast unit strapped to the player's back, and turned a survival horror shooter into a typing tutor with grotesque enemies. The joke is obvious, and the game leans into it with full awareness, but the design underneath the comedy is genuinely effective. Typing the correct word or phrase kills the enemy before it reaches you, and the pressure of an approaching zombie while you're mid-word in a phrase like monkey brains is more stressful than the light gun version managed. What it predicted was the serious game and the educational game as viable commercial propositions rather than institutional software. The idea that you could teach a functional skill, typing speed and accuracy, through a genre framework that players would actually engage with was novel in 2000. Subsequent games built around exercise, language learning, brain training, and music theory all use the same underlying argument, that the compulsion loops of genre gaming could make education feel like play. The Typing of the Dead was making that argument as satire, which made it more effective than if it had tried to be sincere about it. The peripheral itself is the other thing worth noting. The Dreamcast keyboard attachment was a real product that the game required, and the decision to design around non-standard hardware was a position that most publishers avoid because it limits the audience. Sega's willingness to do it anyway. And to do it with a game that committed fully to the bit, produced something that could only have existed on a platform willing to take that kind of commercial risk. Soul Calibur arrived on Dreamcast in 1999 as a port of an arcade game, and became the argument for why console ports could surpass their source material. The arcade version was already considered an excellent fighting game. The Dreamcast version added a mission battle mode with dozens of unique scenarios, additional character content, refined graphics that the Dreamcast hardware actually rendered better than the arcade board in certain respects, and loading times that were shorter than the cabinets. Ports were supposed to be inferior. This made the opposite case so thoroughly that it was used for years afterward as the example of what a port could be. The weapon-based combat system set it apart from every other fighting game of the era. Most fighters were built around unarmed hand-to-hand combat with special moves attached. The entire movement language came from the logic of weapons with reach, weight, and momentum. Meet Tsurugi's katana and Killick staff didn't just look different. They enforced different spatial relationships, different risk calculations, and different timing windows that made character choice a genuine strategic decision rather than an aesthetic one. The game's overall balance and the smoothness of the 8-way run system made it the gold standard of 3D fighting games for the period immediately following its release, and it held that position longer than most genre entries manage. The sequels have been uneven in ways that the original wasn't, which makes the Dreamcast version's specific achievement more remarkable in retrospect. Soul Calibur was the right game at the right time on the right hardware, and those alignments are rarer than they look. Rez was released in 2001 and built a rail shooter around the idea that sound and visuals should respond to each other through the player's actions rather than existing independently. Shooting enemies generates musical beats and tones that layer onto the ambient score, which shifts and builds across each area as you progress. The visual style, wireframe geometry that becomes more elaborate as you advance, mirrors the musical progression in a way that makes the game feel like it's building something rather than just moving forward. That integration of sensory feedback through player action is what synesthesia design means, and Rez was exploring it when it was barely a theoretical concept in game design. The trance vibrator accessory that was sold alongside the game in Japan, a peripheral that vibrated in sync with the music, made the sensory feedback literal in ways that have generated more discussion than almost anything else in the Dreamcast library. The intent was to extend the game's audiovisual integration into a haptic dimension, which is exactly what modern VR designers are now trying to do with controllers and haptic suits. Rez was thinking about full-body sensory engagement in 2001. Rez HD and Rez Infinite have kept the game accessible across subsequent hardware generations, and the VR version of Rez Infinite in particular demonstrates how completely the game's core concept maps on a technology that didn't exist when Tetsuya Mizuguchi designed the original. The design was so forward-looking that the hardware capable of fully realizing it took 15 years to arrive. The original Dreamcast version is where the vision was articulated, and the VR version is where it was completed. Ikaruga is a vertical shooter built around a single mechanic, switching your ship between black and white polarity. And the entirety of what makes the game exceptional comes from how thoroughly that mechanic is explored across its 5 chapters. Black bullets can't hurt a black ship, and same for white bullets and ships. You absorb bullets in your own color to charge your homing laser, and enemies can only be damaged by the opposite polarity. That's the whole system. The depth of what Treasure built from it in 2001 is still being documented by players working through the game's chain combo scoring system decades later. The bullet patterns in Ikaruga aren't random, they're composed. Each wave of enemies is a visual sequence that telegraphs the optimal approach if you can read the color patterns fast enough, and the game operates closer to music notation than traditional shooter design. Getting through a section cleanly feels like executing a piece of music correctly rather than surviving a gauntlet. And the distinction between those two feelings is what separates Ikaruga from every other shooter that uses bullet density as its primary challenge. The difficulty is genuinely steep, and the game makes no compromises about that. Reaching the later chapters requires the kind of pattern memorization and reflex calibration that most players won't invest in without a strong prior attachment to the genre. The chain combo system that gives the game its competitive ceiling requires a level of deliberate, consistent play that goes well beyond survival. Ikaruga is explicitly a game for people who want to be tested, and it tests exactly what it says it will.
Ready?
Crazy Taxi understood something about game feel that most racing and driving games hadn't worked out. That the pleasure of speed is inseparable from the pleasure of consequence. You weren't just driving fast. You were careening through a living city with a passenger in the back, making decisions about which route to take and which shortcuts to risk in real time. And the environment was responding to your choices with the kind of chaos that made every run feel different from the last. The sandbox driving experience that GTA 3 would refine into a genre 2 years later was already present here in a more focused, arcade-distilled form. The Offspring and Bad Religion soundtrack wasn't background music. It was the argument the game was making about what kind of energy it wanted you to feel while playing. The music choice communicated a specific irreverence and velocity that reinforced the design in a way that most games treat as secondary. Crazy Taxi understood that sound and play feel exist on the same axis, and it used both to amplify each other. The session structure, a fixed time limit that you extend by completing fares, is a design choice that makes the game almost infinitely replayable while naturally constraining each session to a digestible length. Every fare is a micro decision about risk versus reward. Take the long route for a bigger tip or rush a shorter fare to keep the meter running. That decision architecture, dressed in neon and punk rock, is tighter than it looks and holds up better than most of the Dreamcast library in terms of pure playability. Seaman is the game on this list that time has made simultaneously more prescient and more strange. A virtual creature, a fish with a human face, that you raise through conversation using the Dreamcast microphone, responding to your voice with questions, observations, and the specific kind of unsettling familiarity that comes from something that understands language but doesn't behave like anything that should understand language. Released in 1999, it was doing what Siri, Alexa, and AI chatbots would eventually become industries around. Natural language interaction with a non-human entity that appears to be listening. The voice recognition was limited by 1999 hardware, and Seaman didn't actually understand meaning so much as it parsed keywords and responded from a scripted tree that was elaborate enough to feel like conversation at the time. That limitation doesn't diminish what the experiment was attempting. It was asking what a relationship between a human and a digital creature could feel like, and it was asking that question decades before the technology existed to answer it properly. Leonard Nimoy, narrating the experience, added a layer of deadpan authority that made the absurdity feel intentional. What Seaman predicted wasn't just voice interaction, but the emotional dynamic that voice interaction creates, the specific uncanniness of talking to something that responds in kind, the anthropomorphization that happens almost involuntarily, the discomfort of something that feels like a relationship without being one. Those dynamics are now the subject of serious psychological research and AI design conversations. Seaman was running the experiment informally in living rooms in 1999.
You're listening to Red Stanton on
Metropolis Street Racer was released in 2000 and was using the Dreamcast internal clock to check the actual time of day and adjust the game's lighting, traffic density, and ambient conditions accordingly. Racing in London at 3 a.m. looked different from racing at noon, not because the game cycled through a day-night animation, but because it was reading a real clock and reflecting real time. That was 2000. The dynamic world systems that games like GTA 5 and Red Dead 2 will be praised for decades later were being prototyped on Dreamcast hardware before most players had thought to want them. The kudos system were a reputation metric that responded not just to whether you won, but to how you drove, was the other thing it was doing that the rest of the racing genre took years to revisit. Overtaking cleanly, maintaining speed through corners, completing challenges with style rather than just efficiency. All of it fed a score that affected what content you could access. The idea that progression should reward how you play rather than just whether you win has since become central to games like Forza Horizon. But Bizarre Creations was building it in 2000. The game is difficult to recommend without qualification because the kudos system's demands are occasionally opaque and some of the challenge design is uneven in ways that reflect its era. The city selection gives the game a geographic ambition that the gameplay doesn't always match. What this game was attempting was bigger than what it fully achieved. But what it was attempting, and when it was attempting it, earns it a place in any honest account of what the Dreamcast saw coming. Choo Choo Rocket launched in 1999 as the first online multiplayer game on a home console, and it did so with a puzzle game about directing mice into rockets while simultaneously directing cats away from the mice. A premise that made the multiplayer adversarial in a way that felt designed for exactly the chaos that low-latency online play produces. For players, each placing directional arrows on a shared board, each trying to route their own mice while disrupting everyone else's routes. The interference and the unpredictability were the game, and putting that game online meant that the interference was coming from real people making real decisions in real time. The technical achievement of running 4-player online at playable latency in 1999 on consumer hardware deserves more recognition than it gets. The Dreamcast modem and Sega server infrastructure were handling something that wasn't supposed to be possible on a home console yet. And Choo Choo Rocket was the proof of concept that demonstrated it worked. Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, and every online console gaming service that followed was building on an existence proof that Choo Choo provided first. The single-player puzzle content is substantial and holds up as a standalone puzzle game without any online component. Hundreds of increasingly complex scenarios that teach the directional routing system through escalating challenge. That content means the game functions as a complete experience even without the online infrastructure that originally made it notable. The multiplayer was the prediction. The puzzle design was the foundation that made the prediction worth making.